If you can kiss my feet, I will marry you.
Billionaire CEO disgraces an old single dad. Kiss my feet and I will marry you. What happened next changed everything. Sir Chris had buried his pride along with his wife 5 years ago. Now, kneeling before the marble floors of Sterling Industries, he wondered if he'd have to bury his dignity too. The billionaire's voice echoed through the lobby. Kiss my feet, old man, and perhaps I'll consider marrying your daughter. Every employee froze. Every camera phone rose. But what Chris did next, and who was watching, would turn a moment of humiliation into the CEO's worst nightmare. Before we go into details, click subscribe, like and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, Africa, and even the United Kingdom. So let me know where you're watching from on comment section. I pray may the good God Almighty bless and preserve you all and your family. Amen. Let's begin. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Apex Innovations' executive suite, painting the luxurious office in hues of amber and gold. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the sprawling cityscape stretched endlessly, a testament to human ambition and achievement. Among those towering structures, Clarissa Chen had built her empire, brick by metaphorical brick, deal by ruthless deal. At 38 years old, she stood as one of the youngest self-made billionaire CEOs in the technology sector, a woman whose name commanded respect, fear, and in some circles, whispered resentment. She stood now behind her custom-made walnut desk, her fingers drumming an impatient rhythm on its polished surface. Her black-tailored suit, perfectly cut to accentuate her commanding presence, seemed to absorb the fading daylight. The leopard print cuffs of her jacket were her only concession to frivolity, a small rebellion against the corporate uniformity she despised. Her dark hair fell in sleek waves past her shoulders, framing a face that had graced the covers of Forbes, Fortune, and Time. But it wasn't her beauty that people remembered. It was the cold calculation in her eyes, the way she could dissect a person's worth in seconds and discard them just as quickly. Today, those eyes were fixed on the man kneeling before her on the cream-colored carpet. Chris Amzo had never imagined his life would lead to this moment. At 52 years old, he had seen his share of hardships, weathered storms that would have broken lesser men. The lines etched into his weathered face told stories of sleepless nights, of meals skipped so his daughter could eat, of pride swallowed and dignity sacrificed on the altar of survival. His olive green shirt, faded from too many washes, hung loosely on his frame, a frame that had once been strong and confident but now seemed diminished by the weight of years spent struggling. His khaki pants bore a patch at the knee, carefully sewn by his own inexperienced hands because he couldn't afford new ones. He knelt there now, his hands resting on his thighs, his head bowed not in submission but in the kind of defeated acceptance that comes when all other options have been exhausted. His salt and pepper hair, more gray than brown these days, was neatly combed despite everything else falling apart around him. Even in his lowest moment, Chris maintained that small dignity, that tiny rebellion against the complete dissolution of self. Look at me when I'm speaking to you. Clarissa's voice cut through the silence like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. Chris slowly raised his eyes to meet hers. The distance between them felt infinite despite being merely feet apart. She stood above him, literally and figuratively, a queen surveying a beggar in her court. The contempt in her expression was unmistakable, not hidden behind any pretense of politeness or social grace. In her world, weakness was an offense, poverty a personal failing. "Do you understand the position you're in, Mr. Amzo?" she asked, her tone clinical, as if she were discussing a disappointing quarterly report rather than a human being's desperation. "You come to me, to MY Company, asking for help. Not as a businessman with a proposal, not as someone with value to offer, but as a beggar. A desperate, pathetic beggar." Each word was carefully chosen, deliberately cruel, designed to strip away whatever remained of his dignity. Chris felt something inside him crack a little more, like ice fracturing under pressure. But he didn't look away. His daughter's face flashed in his mind. Emma, sweet Emma, lying in that hospital bed, her pale skin almost translucent against the white sheets, her breathing shallow and labored. The doctors had given him 6 months. 6 months to find the money for the experimental treatment that might save her life. 6 months before his only child, his reason for living, would be taken from him forever. "I understand," Chris said quietly. his voice steady despite the humiliation burning in his chest. I understand that I'm asking for mercy from someone who has no reason to show it. But my daughter. Your daughter, Clarissa interrupted, circling around her desk with the predatory grace of a big cat, is not my concern. The world is full of sick children, Mr. Amzo. Should I bankrupt myself funding treatments for all of them? Where does my responsibility end and personal accountability begin? She stopped a few feet away from him, close enough that he could smell her expensive perfume, something exotic and exclusive, probably costing more than his monthly rent. The scent was intoxicating and repulsive at the same time, a symbol of the vast chasm between their worlds. You had a daughter to care for, yet here you are, middle-aged and broke, Clarissa continued, her voice dripping with disdain. Where did you go wrong, Mr. Amzo? What choices led you to this moment, kneeling on my floor like some medieval peasant begging his lord for scraps? The question hung in the air, rhetorical but demanding an answer nonetheless. Chris felt the familiar weight of guilt and shame pressing down on him, the same weight he carried every day. How had he ended up here? The question that haunted his sleepless nights now voiced by this cold, beautiful stranger who held his daughter's life in her manicured hands. I was a teacher, Chris began, his voice barely above a whisper. High school mathematics. I loved it, watching kids understand concepts they'd struggled with, seeing their faces light up when everything finally clicked. It wasn't lucrative, but it was meaningful. I thought that mattered more. Clarissa let out a short, harsh laugh. Meaning? How wonderfully naive. Let me guess, you believed in making a difference, in an ability of service, in all those pretty lies people tell themselves to justify their mediocrity. I believed in my daughter, Chris said, a note of defiance creeping into his voice despite his vulnerable position. After my wife died in childbirth, Emma became my entire world. I raised her alone, and yes, we struggled financially, but she never doubted she was loved. She never went to bed afraid or uncertain about her worth. How touching, Clarissa said, her voice flat and unmoved. And where did all that love get you? Here, on your knees, while your precious daughter lies dying because you can't afford to save her. The words were like physical blows, each one landing with precision in the softest parts of Chris's heart. He wanted to argue, to defend his choices, to explain how Emma's mother's medical bills had bankrupted them before they even began, how each year brought new challenges that depleted whatever meager savings he managed to accumulate, how the American healthcare system was designed to crush people exactly like him. But he knew none of it would matter to the woman standing before him. Clarissa Chen hadn't built her empire by understanding or caring about such struggles. She had built it by recognizing weakness and exploiting it. The experimental treatment Emma needs costs $2 million, Chris said, steering the conversation back to the only thing that mattered. The doctors say she has a 70% chance of full recovery with it. Without it, she has 6 months at best. I've tried everything: fundraisers, loans, grants, crowdfunding. I've sold everything I own. I've begged every person I know and many I don't. You're my last hope, Ms. Chen. Last hope, Clarissa repeated, tasting the words. She moved closer, standing directly before him now, close enough that he had to tilt his head back to maintain eye contact. How biblical. How dramatic. Do you know what I see when I look at you, Mr. Amzo? Chris didn't answer, sensing the question was rhetorical. I see a man who made poor choices dressed up as noble sacrifices, Clarissa continued, her voice low and intense. I see someone who confused love with provision, who thought good intentions could substitute for competence. You loved your daughter, certainly, but you failed her in every practical way that matters. And now, in your desperation, you come to me, a woman you don't know, who owes you nothing, expecting what? Charity. Compassion. A miracle. I'm not expecting anything, Chris said quietly. I'm asking. There's a difference. Something flickered across Clarissa's face, so quick Chris couldn't identify it before her mask of disdain slipped back into place. She studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes unreadable, calculating. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft hum of the city beyond the windows and the quiet rhythm of Chris's breathing. You're right, Clarissa finally said. There is a difference. Expectation implies entitlement. Asking implies humility. She paused, her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I appreciate humility in my supplicants. It makes them more manageable. Chris felt a chill run down his spine at her choice of words. Supplicants. Not equals, not fellow humans worthy of basic dignity, but supplicants, subjects petitioning a sovereign for favors. In Clarissa's world, money wasn't just currency. It was power, the divine right of the wealthy to determine the fates of the poor. I have a proposition for you, Mr. Amzo, Clarissa said, her voice taking on a different quality, still cold, but now with an edge of amusement that was somehow worse than her contempt. I'm not without sympathy for your situation. The loss of a child is, I imagine, devastating. So I'm prepared to help you. $2 million for your daughter's treatment, plus whatever additional care she needs for a full recovery. Chris's heart leaped with sudden, desperate hope. Ms. Chen, I'm not finished, she cut him off sharply. Nothing in this world is free, Mr. Amzo. Everything has a price. The question is whether you're willing to pay it. Anything, Chris said immediately, the word escaping before he could consider the implications. I'll do anything. I can work for you, for however long it takes to pay back every penny. I may not be wealthy, but I'm educated, hardworking. Clarissa laughed, a genuine sound of amusement this time, though no warmth accompanied it. Work for me? Doing what, exactly? You're a teacher, Mr. Amzo, and not even a successful one by any measurable standard. You have no skills I need, no expertise I value. Your labor is worth nothing to me. The blunt assessment hit Chris like a punch to the gut. His entire adult life, dismissed as worthless in a single breath. He felt something inside him begin to crumble, the last remnants of his self-worth disintegrating under the relentless assault of her words. However, Clarissa continued, circling behind him now, forcing him to remain kneeling while she moved out of his sight. There is something you can offer me. Not your skills, not your labor, but your pride, your dignity, your sense of self-worth. I want you to surrender it completely, right here, right now. Chris's pulse quickened. I don't understand. Don't you? Her voice came from behind him, and he felt her presence like a physical weight. I'm offering you a trade, Mr. Amzo. Your daughter's life for your dignity. $2 million and her complete recovery, guaranteed, in exchange for absolute humiliation. Not just today, but ongoing. Not just privately, but publicly. She moved back into his line of sight, positioning herself directly in front of him again. Slowly, deliberately, she extended her right foot forward. She wore expensive Italian leather heels, black and sleek, probably worth more than Chris earned in a month when he was still teaching. Kiss my feet, Clarissa said, her voice steady and clear, and I will marry you. The words hung in the air like a suspended sentence, their meaning taking a moment to fully penetrate Chris's comprehension. He stared at her foot, then slowly raised his eyes to her face, searching for some sign this was a cruel joke, some indication of humanity behind the cold calculation. You want me to, Chris began, his voice breaking. Kiss my feet. Clarissa repeated, enunciating each word with crystalline clarity. As a gesture of your complete submission. Your acknowledgement that I am superior to you in every way that matters. That you exist only at my pleasure. That your daughter lives only because I choose to allow it. But why? Chris asked, genuine confusion mixing with his horror. Why marriage? Why not just write a check if you want to help? Because a check can be written by anyone, Clarissa explained, her voice taking on a lecturing tone, as if explaining a simple concept to a slow student. But marriage is a statement. It's power made manifest. I want the world to see me with someone like you, a broken man elevated by my grace, a living testament to my generosity and status. You'll be my pet project, my charity case, my proof that I can take the lowest and, through association with me, make them relevant. The full horror of her proposition crystallized in Chris's mind. She wasn't offering mercy. She was offering ownership. His daughter's life in exchange for becoming a trophy, a living symbol of Clarissa's wealth and power. He would be paraded before the world as evidence of her magnanimity, a before and after comparison that elevated her while diminishing him. And if I refuse? Chris asked, though he already knew the answer. Clarissa shrugged, a casual gesture made elegant by her expensive clothes and confidence. Then you walk out of here with nothing but my receptionist's best wishes. Your daughter dies. You live with the knowledge that you could have saved her, but your pride was more important, and I forget you ever existed 5 minutes after you leave. She said it so matter-of-factly, with such casual cruelty, that Chris felt his stomach turn. This wasn't just a negotiation to her. It was entertainment. She was enjoying this, savoring his anguish the way a connoisseur might appreciate a fine wine. You're a monster, Chris whispered, the words escaping before he could stop them. Monster. Clarissa tilted her head, considering the word. How dramatic. I prefer to think of myself as a realist. I understand how the world actually works, not how naive people wish it worked. Wealth is power, power determines survival, and everything has a price. Your daughter's life has a price. Your dignity has a price. The only question is which you value more. She was right, Chris realized with sinking horror. She was absolutely right. Because as much as he wanted to rage against her cruelty, as much as every fiber of his being rebelled against the degradation she demanded, Emma's face kept appearing in his mind. Emma laughing at his terrible dad jokes. Emma graduating high school with honors despite their financial struggles. Emma in her hospital bed, tubes and wires connecting her to machines that beeped and hummed, her weak voice telling him not to worry, that she'd be okay, even as they both knew she was lying to comfort him. How long? Chris asked, his voice hollow. How long would this arrangement last? 1 year, Clarissa said immediately, as if she'd anticipated the question. 1 year as my husband, living in my home, accompanying me to social events, playing the role of the reformed charity case. After 12 months, we divorce quietly. You get to keep whatever allowance I've given you during that time. Your daughter is fully recovered, and you're free to return to your mediocre existence. Though I imagine you'll find it difficult, having tasted luxury. You've thought about this, Chris observed, a statement rather than a question. I've thought about everything, Mr. Amzo. That's why I'm a billionaire and you're kneeling on my carpet. She flexed her extended foot slightly, drawing his attention back to it. Now, make your choice. Kiss my feet and accept my proposition, or leave and let nature take its course with your daughter. But choose quickly. I have a dinner engagement at 7, and I don't like to be late. The callousness of it, discussing his daughter's potential death in the same breath as dinner plans, made Chris's blood run cold. But it also clarified something for him. This wasn't about the money for Clarissa. She could write a $2 million check and never notice the absence. This was about power, about exercising control, about proving to herself and the world that she could take a desperate man and break him completely. And Chris realized, with a clarity that came from the absolute bottom of desperation, that he was going to let her. Not because he was weak, though she would certainly perceive it that way. Not because he believed he deserved this humiliation, though part of him wondered if she was right about his failures. But because Emma deserved to live. Because his daughter, who had never asked to be born into poverty, who had never complained about their struggles, who had always looked at him with love and trust despite his inability to provide the life she deserved a chance. And if the price of that chance was his dignity, his pride, his sense of self-worth, then it was a price he would pay without hesitation. Chris took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment. He thought of his late wife, Catherine, and wondered what she would think of this moment. Would she understand? Would she forgive him for what he was about to do? Or would she be disappointed in the man he'd become, the desperate creature willing to debase himself for mercy? But Catherine was gone, and Emma was dying, and philosophy and pride were luxuries afforded only to those not watching their child slip away. Chris opened his eyes and looked at Clarissa's foot. Then, slowly, maintaining eye contact with her the entire time, refusing to grant her even that small victory, he leaned forward and pressed his lips against the smooth leather of her expensive shoe. The leather was cool against his lips, the taste bitter, whether from the material itself or from the bile rising in his throat, he couldn't say. He held the position for a long moment, this kiss that sealed a devil's bargain, that traded everything he was for everything he loved. When he finally pulled back, the expression on Clarissa's face was one of pure triumph. Not joy, not pleasure, but the satisfied smile of someone who had gambled on human nature and won. She had bet that love could triumph over pride, that desperation could bend even the strongest will, and Chris's submission had proven her right. "Excellent," she said, her voice carrying notes of satisfaction. "You've made the correct choice, Mr. Amzo. Or should I say, my future husband." The words should have felt surreal, but they didn't. They felt inevitable, like the ending to a story that had been written long before Chris had walked into this office. He remained kneeling, unsure if he had permission to rise, unsure of anything except that his life had just fundamentally changed in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. "Stand up," Clarissa commanded, and Chris obeyed, his knees protesting the movement after being folded so long. Standing, he realized just how much taller than him she appeared in her heels, another small psychological dominance asserted through fashion. They were probably close to the same height normally, but she had engineered even that inequality. "We'll need to move quickly," Clarissa said, her tone shifting to something more businesslike now that the entertainment portion of their encounter had concluded. "Your daughter's treatment begins immediately. I'll have my personal physician contact her doctors tonight to coordinate care. She'll be transferred to St. Augustine's private medical center by tomorrow morning. They have the best facilities and the most experienced team for her condition." The sudden shift from cruelty to efficiency gave Chris whiplash. "Tomorrow morning," he repeated numbly. "I don't do anything halfway, Mr. Amzo," Clarissa said, moving back behind her desk and pulling out a tablet. Her fingers flew across the screen with practiced ease. "When I commit to something, I commit fully. Your daughter will receive the best possible care, starting immediately. I'll have my lawyers draft a prenuptial agreement tonight. We'll sign it tomorrow after your daughter is settled. The wedding will take place in 3 days, a small, private ceremony. Nothing elaborate. This isn't a love match, after all, just a transaction." 3 days, Chris echoed, his mind struggling to process how quickly his entire existence was being reorganized. "Is there a problem?" Clarissa looked up from her tablet, one perfectly shaped eyebrow raised. "You wanted help urgently. I'm providing it urgently, unless you're having second thoughts." "No," Chris said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "No second thoughts. I need to process all of this." "Process on your own time," Clarissa said dismissively. "Right now, I need information. Your daughter's full medical records, her current doctor's contact information, your current address, any other dependents or obligations I should know about. I'm having my assistant enter now to collect all relevant details." As if summoned by her words, the office door opened and a young man entered, impeccably dressed and carrying another tablet. He didn't even glance at Chris, his attention entirely focused on Clarissa. "Ms. Chen," he said with crisp efficiency, "you asked me to come in." "Yes, Marcus. This is Christopher Amzo, my fiancé." The word rolled off her tongue easily, as if announcing engagements to men she just humiliated was routine. Get all his relevant information. His daughter needs immediate medical intervention. Contact Dr. Richardson at St. Augustine's and have him prepare for a patient transfer tomorrow morning. Terminal stage leukemia requiring experimental treatment protocol. Marcus's fingers were already moving across his tablet, taking notes with impressive speed. "Understood. Should I prepare the standard dependency contract?" "Yes, and have legal draft the prenuptial agreement. Use template 7, complete financial separation, 1-year term, standard dissolution clause." Clarissa rattled off instructions like a general deploying troops, every detail accounted for, every contingency planned. "Also, clear my schedule for Friday afternoon. We'll need 2 hours for the ceremony." "Friday afternoon," Marcus confirmed, still not looking at Chris. "Will you need media management?" "No," Clarissa said firmly. "Keep this quiet for now. We'll release the announcement on my terms, in my timing. I don't want paparazzi camping outside St. Augustine's bothering sick children." It was the first thing she'd said that sounded remotely human, Chris thought. Not compassionate exactly, but at least acknowledging that her actions had implications beyond her own entertainment. "Mr. Amzo," Marcus finally addressed him directly, his tone professional but not unkind. "If you'll come with me, we can gather the necessary information and I'll explain the process moving forward. I understand this is overwhelming, but I assure you, Ms. Chen's team will handle everything efficiently. Chris nodded mutely, grateful for even that small gesture of consideration from someone. As he moved toward the door, following Marcus, Clarissa's voice stopped him. One more thing, Christopher. It was the first time she'd used his first name, and the familiarity felt wrong, invasive. Don't mistake my willingness to help your daughter for softness. This is a business arrangement, nothing more. I'm purchasing your cooperation, your presence, your submission. In exchange, your daughter lives. But cross me, embarrass me, or fail to uphold your end of this bargain, and the deal is void. Am I absolutely clear? Chris turned back to face her, this woman who now held every aspect of his life in her hands. She stood framed by the window, the city lights beginning to twinkle as dusk settled over the skyline, looking every inch the powerful executive she was. In that moment, Chris understood completely what he'd signed up for. This wasn't redemption or salvation. It was ownership. Crystal clear, Ms. Chen, he said quietly. Good. She smiled that cold, calculating smile. Oh, and Christopher? You can stop calling me Ms. Chen. We are engaged now. Call me Clarissa. The command to use her first name felt like another layer of the humiliation. Forced intimacy without actual intimacy, the illusion of closeness masking a relationship based entirely on inequality and control. But Chris nodded, accepting even this small degradation, and followed Marcus out of the office. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and Chris found himself in a corridor that screamed wealth. Thick carpeting, original artwork on the walls, recessed lighting creating an ambience of sophisticated luxury. Marcus led him to a smaller office down the hall, gesturing for him to sit in one of two leather chairs. Can I get you anything? Water. Coffee? Marcus asked, his professionalism softening slightly now that they were away from Clarissa's presence. Water, please, Chris said, his throat suddenly parched. He couldn't remember the last time he'd drunk anything. The day had been consumed with anxiety about this meeting. Marcus poured water from a crystal decanter into a matching glass and handed it to Chris before settling into the chair across from him. I know this seems like a lot, Marcus said gently. Ms. Chen can be intense, but I want you to know that when she commits to something, she follows through. Your daughter will receive the best care available. That much I can promise you. At what cost? Chris asked quietly, sipping the water. It tasted pure, filtered, expensive. Even the water was better in this world. Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. Ms. Chen is complicated. She's brilliant, ruthless, and deeply driven. She'll demand a lot from you: perfect behavior, unwavering loyalty, absolute discretion. But if you play by her rules, you'll find she can also be surprisingly fair. Just don't ever forget that this is business to her. Everything is business. How long have you worked for her? Chris asked, suddenly curious about the man who seemed to navigate Clarissa's world with such practiced ease. 5 years, Marcus replied. Best and worst job I've ever had. The pay is phenomenal, the challenges intellectually stimulating, the opportunities for advancement unlimited. But it requires a certain acceptance that normal rules don't apply to people like Ms. Chen. She exists in a different reality, one where money can solve problems by loyalty and reshape circumstances according to her will. And does it? Reshape circumstances, I mean. Marcus smiled, a hint of sadness in his expression. You're about to find out firsthand, Mr. Amzo. Now, let's collect that information so we can get your daughter the help she needs. For the next hour, Chris provided every detail of Emma's medical history, his current living situation, his financial status, or lack thereof. Marcus documented everything with meticulous precision, occasionally asking clarifying questions, never judging. When they finished, Marcus handed Chris a business card. My personal cell number is on there, Marcus said. Call me anytime if you have questions or concerns. I'll be your primary point of contact for the next few weeks. Tomorrow morning at 6, a car will pick you up from your current address and take you to Street Augustine's. Pack a bag. You'll be staying at Ms. Chen's penthouse starting tomorrow evening. Tomorrow evening. Chris repeated, the reality hitting him again. That soon. Ms. Chen doesn't believe in prolonging transitions, Marcus explained. She'll want you acclimated to your new life as quickly as possible. The penthouse has a guest wing where you'll have your own private space initially. It will give you time to adjust before the wedding. Chris nodded, processing all of this. Tomorrow morning, Emma would begin treatment. Tomorrow evening, he would move into Clarissa's home. In 3 days, they would be married. His entire existence, completely restructured in less than 72 hours. One last thing, Marcus said, his tone gentle but serious. I know how Ms. Chen came across in there, and I won't pretend she isn't exactly what she appears to be, demanding, cold, sometimes cruel. But I've also seen her do remarkably generous things when no one was watching. She funded an entire pediatric cancer wing at St. Augustine's anonymously. She's paid off medical debt for dozens of families. She doesn't like appearing soft. Weakness, to her, is vulnerability, and vulnerability is dangerous. Why are you telling me this? Chris asked. Marcus stood, straightening his already perfect tie. Because you're going to need something to hold onto during the difficult moments ahead. And knowing that there might be more to her than what you saw today. Well, it might help. Or it might not. But at least you'll know. The car that arrived at Chris's modest apartment the next morning was a Mercedes S-Class, black and gleaming in the early dawn light. The driver, a professional man in his 50s named Robert, helped Chris with his single battered suitcase, the entirety of his possessions that he was bringing into this new life. Chris had packed the night before, moving through his small apartment in a daze, trying to decide what items deserve space in Clarissa's world. In the end, he'd taken only clothes, a few photographs of Emma and Catherine, and a worn copy of Catherine's favorite book of poetry. Everything else, the second-hand furniture, the kitchen supplies, the humble decorations that had made this place a home, would be boxed up and put into storage. Marcus had arranged it all with typical efficiency, assuring Chris that his belongings would be safe and accessible should he ever want them back. The unspoken implication hung in the air. Why would you want any of this back after experiencing luxury? St. Augustine's private medical center occupied an entire city block, its gleaming glass and steel structure looking more like a five-star hotel than a hospital. Robert pulled into the private entrance, where Marcus was already waiting, tablet in hand, looking as immaculate at 6 in the morning as he had at 7 the previous evening. Mr. Amzo, Marcus greeted him warmly. Dr. Richardson is waiting for us in the executive wing. Your daughter's transfer is already complete. She arrived about an hour ago and has been settling into her suite. Suite? Chris asked, following Marcus through corridors that bore no resemblance to the stark, institutional hallways of the public hospital where Emma had been.
Saint Augustines Premier Accommodation, Marcus explained.
Private room with a separate sitting area, premium amenities, 24/7 nursing staff, and the best view in the facility. Ms. Chen insisted. They took a private elevator to the 7th floor, emerging into a space that looked more like an upscale apartment complex than a medical facility. Soft lighting, artwork on the walls, plush carpeting. If not for the occasional nurse or medical equipment, Chris might have forgotten they were in a hospital at all. Dr. Richardson met them outside room 717, a distinguished man in his 60s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. Mr. Amzo, I'm Frederick Richardson. I've been reviewing your daughter's case extensively, and I want you to know we are going to do everything possible for her. The treatment protocol we'll be using is cutting edge, with remarkable success rates. I'm genuinely optimistic about Emma's prognosis. Can I see her? Chris asked, his voice rough with emotion. He'd spent the entire drive over rehearsing what he'd say to Emma, how he'd explain the sudden change in their circumstances without revealing the full, humiliating truth of what he'd done to secure it. Of course, Dr. Richardson said, stepping aside. She's been asking for you since she arrived. Quite the spirited young woman you've raised. Chris pushed open the door to find Emma sitting up in a bed that probably cost more than their annual rent, looking out a window that offered a panoramic view of the city. At 23, she still looked heartbreakingly young, especially now with her dark hair cut short after chemotherapy and her face pale from illness. But when she turned and saw him, her smile lit up the entire room. Dad! Emma exclaimed, her voice weak but filled with genuine joy. What is happening? This place is incredible. And they said my treatment starts today. Some experimental thing that wasn't available before? How did you manage this? Chris crossed to her bedside, taking her hand carefully, mindful of the 4 already inserted in her arm. I found a way, sweetheart. That's all that matters. Emma's eyes, so much like her mother's, studied him carefully. Despite her illness, she'd always been perceptive, able to read him better than anyone. Dad, this kind of facility, this kind of treatment, it must cost a fortune. Where did you get the money? Don't worry about that right now, Chris said, smoothing her short hair back from her forehead in a gesture as old as her childhood. Just focus on getting better. That's all I need you to do. Dad. Emma's voice took on that firm tone she used when she wouldn't accept deflection. Tell me the truth. What did you do? Chris hesitated, then decided on a version of the truth that would satisfy her without revealing the full degradation of what had transpired. I found a sponsor. Someone who's agreed to cover your medical expenses. A sponsor, Emma repeated skeptically. Just like that. Out of charity. Not exactly, Chris admitted. There are conditions, obligations I've agreed to. Before Emma could question further, there was a knock on the door. Marcus entered, followed by a woman Chris had never seen before, tall, elegant, probably in her 50s, wearing an expensive cream-colored suit. Mr. Amzo, Emma, Marcus said smoothly. I'd like to introduce Victoria Chen, Ms. Clarissa Chen's mother. Victoria Chen moved into the room with the same commanding presence her daughter possessed, though tempered with something that might have been warmth. She smiled at Emma first, a genuine expression that transformed her aristocratic features. Emma, Victoria said gently, it's lovely to meet you. My daughter has told me about your situation. I'm so glad we could help. Emma looked bewildered, glancing between Victoria and Chris. Your daughter? I don't understand. Allow me to explain, Victoria said, settling gracefully into a chair near Emma's bed. My daughter, Clarissa, is a successful businesswoman. That's understating it, Mom, came Clarissa's voice from the doorway, and Chris turned to see her entering the room. She looked different than yesterday, softer somehow, wearing tailored slacks and a cashmere sweater instead of her severe business suit. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore minimal makeup. She looked younger, more approachable, and Chris felt a flicker of confusion at the transformation. Emma, Clarissa said, moving to stand beside Chris, close enough that he could feel the heat from her body. I'm Clarissa Chen. And I'm going to be your stepmother. The words dropped into the room like a bomb. Emma's eyes widened, her gaze snapping to Chris's face. What? Your father and I are getting married, Clarissa continued, her voice matter-of-fact but not unkind. Friday, actually. It's been something of a whirlwind romance, but when you know, you know. She reached out and took Chris's hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that, 6 months later, the autumn leaves danced outside the penthouse windows, painting the city in shades of amber and gold. Chris stood in what had become his favorite spot, the reading nook overlooking the park, watching the sunset with a sense of profound peace he'd never expected to find in this place. 6 months had passed since that humiliating day when he'd knelt on Clarissa's office floor and kissed her feet. 6 months of transformation, revelation, and against all odds, redemption. Emma was in complete remission. The experimental treatment had worked beyond anyone's expectations. Last week, Dr. Richardson had declared her cancer-free, her body responding so well that she'd been able to return to her graduate studies. She was living in the guest wing of the penthouse now, her laughter filling the spaces that had once felt cold and empty. She'd become close with Clarissa's mother Victoria, the two of them often spending afternoons together discussing art, literature, and life. But the real miracle wasn't Emma's physical healing. It was the healing that had occurred between Chris and Clarissa. The marriage that had begun as a transaction had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. The turning point had come 3 months in, during a charity gala where Clarissa had introduced Chris to her peers. He'd overheard 2 of her colleagues making dismissive comments about him, calling him a gold digger and questioning what she saw in such an old, ordinary man. Chris had expected Clarissa to laugh it off or even agree. Instead, she turned on them with fury he'd never witnessed, her voice cutting and precise as she'd eviscerated them in front of the entire gala. Christopher Amzo, she'd said, her voice ringing with conviction, is worth more than both of you combined. He's a man who sacrificed everything, his pride, his dignity, his sense of self, for love. While you two inherited your wealth and your positions, he earned his character through suffering and sacrifice. He taught mathematics to inner-city kids for 20 years, changing hundreds of lives. He raised a brilliant daughter alone after his wife died. And when faced with an impossible choice, he chose love over ego. That's not weakness. That's strength of a kind neither of you will ever possess. The room had fallen silent, and Chris had seen something in Clarissa's eyes he'd never seen before. Respect. Real, genuine respect. That night, when they'd returned to the penthouse, Clarissa had done something unprecedented. She'd apologized. "What I did to you that first day," she'd said, unable to meet his eyes. "Making you kneel, kiss my feet, humiliating you like that, it was cruel. Unconscionable. I told myself I was teaching you about the realities of power, but the truth is I was just exercising control because I could. Because somewhere along the way, I'd confused strength with cruelty." "Why?" Chris had asked simply. "Why did you do it?" Clarissa had been quiet for a long moment. "Because my father did the same thing to my mother. Made her beg, made her submit, reminded her constantly that she existed at his pleasure. I watched him break her spirit over 20 years of marriage. And I swore I'd never be the weak one, never be the one on their knees. I'd be the one with power, always, even if it meant becoming the very monster I'd hated." The confession had cracked something open between them. In the weeks that followed, they'd begun actually talking, not the surface-level exchanges required by their arrangement, but real conversations. Chris had told her about Catherine, about his years of teaching, about the quiet joy he'd found in helping struggling students understand difficult concepts. Clarissa had shared her own story, growing up in wealth but watching her mother's degradation, building her empire as armor against vulnerability, surrounding herself with people who feared her because she didn't know how to let anyone close enough to truly know her. They'd discovered unexpected commonalities. Both were readers, devouring books with similar tastes. Both loved classical music. Both harbored a dry wit that sparked genuine laughter between them. Slowly, carefully, something like friendship had emerged from the ruins of that humiliating beginning. And then, perhaps inevitably, friendship had deepened into something more. Chris couldn't pinpoint the exact moment he'd fallen in love with Clarissa. Maybe it was watching her with Emma, showing a tenderness she hid from the rest of the world. Maybe it was the night she'd cried in his arms after a brutal board meeting, allowing herself to be vulnerable with him for the first time. Maybe it was the morning he'd found her reading one of Catherine's favorite poems, tears streaming down her face as she finally allowed herself to feel the grief she'd suppressed for so long. For Clarissa, she'd later tell him, it was the day Chris had defended her to Emma. Her daughter had been upset about something Clarissa had said, some thoughtless, cutting remark that was pure habit, and Emma had called her cruel. Chris had gently but firmly explained to Emma that cruelty was often armor, that the people who seemed hardest were frequently the ones who'd been hurt the most, that Clarissa's journey toward openness was real and deserved patience. "He saw me," Clarissa would say later. "Not the billionaire, not the CEO, not the ice queen everyone else sees. He saw the scared girl who watched her father destroy her mother and vowed never to be that vulnerable. And he didn't judge me for it. He just understood." Now, as Chris watched the sunset, he felt Clarissa's arms wrap around him from behind, her chin resting on his shoulder. "Penny for your thoughts," she murmured. "Just reflecting," Chris said, covering her hands with his, "on how far we've come. How different everything is from what I expected. Do you ever regret it?" Clarissa asked quietly. "That first day? What I made you do?" Chris turned in her arms to face her. 6 months ago, he would have said yes without hesitation. But now, having traveled this strange and unexpected journey, his answer was more complicated. "I regret the cruelty," he said honestly. "I regret the humiliation, the degradation, the way you wielded your power like a weapon. But I don't regret the outcome. Because that moment of humiliation led to Emma's healing. It led to this, to us, to discovering that two broken people can help heal each other." Clarissa's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I don't deserve you." "Yes, you do," Chris said firmly. You deserve love, compassion, acceptance, all the things you were denied growing up. You deserve someone who sees past the armor to the woman underneath. And I get to be that person. I consider that a privilege. The year is almost up, Clarissa said, and Chris heard the fear in her voice. Our contract expires in 6 weeks. You could leave. Take the settlement, start fresh, be free of me and everything I represent. Chris cupped her face in his hands, looking directly into her eyes. I'm not going anywhere, Clarissa. Not now, not in 6 weeks, not ever, unless you want me to go. I don't, she whispered. I never want you to go. I love you, Chris. I think I started loving you the moment you looked me in the eyes while kissing my feet, refusing to give me even that small surrender, maintaining your dignity even in humiliation. You showed me what real strength looks like. I love you too, Chris said, and kissed her, a kiss that was nothing like that degrading moment on her office floor, but instead a meeting of equals, of partners, of 2 people who'd found each other through the most unlikely circumstances. When they parted, Clarissa pulled a document from her pocket. I had the lawyers draw this up, she said, handing it to Chris. He unfolded it, scanning the legal language. It was their prenuptial agreement, torn in half. I don't want contracts between us anymore, Clarissa said. No agreements about obligations or timelines or terms. I want a real marriage, Chris. Not based on transactions, but on love, on partnership, on being better together than we are apart. Are you sure? Chris asked, even as hope bloomed in his chest. You're giving up a lot of protections. I'm not giving up anything, Clarissa said. I'm gaining everything that matters. You, Emma, a family, the things all my money could never buy. Chris pulled her close, holding her tight. Then yes. 1,000 times yes. Let's tear up all the contracts and start over. Really start over, as equals this time. Emma's voice called from the other room. Dad, Clarissa, dinner's ready. And I'm not eating alone while you 2 are being disgustingly romantic in there. They both laughed, the sound full of genuine joy. Hand in hand, they walked toward the dining room where Emma had set the table, Victoria having been invited to join them. It was becoming their tradition, family dinners several times a week, filling the penthouse with warmth and laughter and the kind of love that money could never purchase. As Chris took his seat at the table, Emma on one side and Clarissa on the other, Victoria smiling at them all with grandmotherly affection, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He'd entered Clarissa's office 6 months ago as a broken man, desperate and defeated, willing to surrender his dignity for his daughter's life. He'd knelt on that floor, kissed those feet, and felt his soul crack under the weight of humiliation. But from that lowest point, something unexpected had grown. Not despite the degradation, but somehow through it, both he and Clarissa had been forced to confront their true selves, his capacity for selfless love, her capacity for change and vulnerability. They'd both been broken in different ways, both armored against hurt through different mechanisms. And somehow, impossibly, they'd helped heal each other. The path to redemption, Chris had learned, was rarely straightforward. Sometimes it led through the darkest valleys, through moments of profound humiliation and loss. But on the other side, if you were willing to be vulnerable, to grow, to see beyond the surface of circumstances, sometimes you found something more valuable than dignity or pride or wealth. You found love. Real, transformative, healing love. What are you thinking about? Clarissa asked softly, noticing his contemplative expression. Chris looked at her, this woman who had once seemed like a monster but had revealed herself to be as wounded and seeking as he was. He looked at Emma, healthy and radiant, her laughter a sound he'd feared he'd never hear again. He looked at Victoria, at this makeshift family they'd built from the ruins of broken pasts and desperate beginnings. I'm thinking, Chris said, squeezing Clarissa's hand, about how sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead to the best outcomes. How humiliation can be the doorway to humility, and humility to genuine connection. How we can't always control what happens to us, but we can control who we become in response. That's very philosophical, Dad, Emma teased. But can we eat now? This pasta is getting cold. Everyone laughed, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics. Emma's graduate research, Clarissa's upcoming business trip, Victoria's art gallery opening next month. The easy flow of family discussion, the warmth of connection, the security of belonging. Later that night, after Emma and Victoria had left, after the dishes were done and the penthouse was quiet, Chris and Clarissa stood once more at the window overlooking the city. The same window where, months ago, Clarissa had stood alone, powerful but isolated, convinced that control was the same as strength and that vulnerability was weakness. "Thank you," Clarissa said quietly. "For what?" "For not giving up on me. For seeing past the cruelty to the fear underneath. For teaching me that love requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires courage, and that true strength isn't about having power over others but about having the courage to be honest about who we are." Chris pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. "Thank you for saving Emma. For giving us this chance. For being brave enough to change." "We saved each other," Clarissa murmured, "in the ways that matter most." And as they stood there, watching the city lights sparkle below them, Chris understood a fundamental truth, that sometimes our darkest moments contain the seeds of our greatest transformations. That humiliation can lead to humility, which can lead to genuine connection. That the people who hurt us most can sometimes become our greatest teachers, if we are willing to see past the surface to the wounded human underneath. He'd knelt on Clarissa's office floor a broken man, prepared to sacrifice everything for love. He stood here now, whole again, having discovered that love, real, transformative, healing love, was worth every sacrifice, every humiliation, every moment of darkness. Because on the other side of that darkness was light. On the other side of humiliation was healing. On the other side of transaction was transformation. And on the other side of Clarissa's cruel proposition was a love neither of them had known they were capable of. A love that had changed everything. 2 years later, the community center stood in one of the city's most underserved neighborhoods, a modern building that seemed to glow with possibility. Above the entrance, gleaming letters read, "The Catherine Amzo Memorial Learning Center, founded by the Chen Amzo Foundation." Chris stood at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Clarissa beside him, Emma on his other side. In her arms, Emma held their newest family member, 6-month-old Catherine Grace, named after the grandmother she'd never met and the grace that had transformed their family. Clarissa had insisted on the center bearing Catherine's name. "Your wife gave you Emma," she'd said when proposing the idea. "And Emma's existence gave you the capacity for the kind of love that saved me. Catherine's legacy should be honored." The center would provide free tutoring, college preparation, and mentorship for underprivileged students. Everything Chris had done as a teacher, now scaled up and supported by Clarissa's resources and business acumen. 20 full-time teachers, state-of-the-art facilities, full scholarships for students who needed them. "Ready?" Clarissa asked, squeezing his hand. Chris nodded, and together they cut the ribbon. The crowd applauded. Neighborhood residents, former students of Chris's, members of the board, Victoria beaming with pride. As they toured the facility later, Chris stopped in front of a plaque in the main lobby. It read, "True strength is not the absence of vulnerability, but the courage to be vulnerable anyway." This center stands as a testament to the transformative power of sacrifice, love, and second chances. Below it were 3 names, Catherine Amzo, Christopher Amzo, and Clarissa Chen Amzo. "It's perfect," Chris said softly. "It's a beginning," Clarissa corrected. "There are 17 more neighborhoods that need centers like this. We have the resources. We have the knowledge. We have the obligation to do more." Chris looked at his wife, because that's what she truly was now, not in contract but in every meaningful sense, and marveled at her transformation. The woman who'd once demanded he kiss her feet now spent her days figuring out how to lift others up. The woman who'd viewed wealth as a tool for dominance now wielded it as an instrument of service. "What are you thinking?" Clarissa asked, recognizing his contemplative look. "I'm thinking about full circles," Chris said. "How we started at the lowest point and somehow ended up here. How the worst day of my life led to the best years." "Do you ever tell Emma?" Clarissa asked quietly. "About that first day? What really happened?" Chris shook his head. "She knows we had an unconventional beginning. She knows you helped us when no one else would. That's enough. The details of how we started matter less than where we ended up." "But you remember," Clarissa said, and there was still guilt in her voice. That moment will always be there between us. Yes, Chris acknowledged. I remember. But I also remember every moment since. Every kindness, every transformation, every instance of you choosing love over power. That moment was real, and it was terrible, but it doesn't define us. What defines us is what we built from it. Clarissa leaned against him, and Chris wrapped his arm around her shoulders. Through the window, they could see Emma playing with baby Catherine, Victoria beside them, all three laughing at something. I used to think happiness was about control, Clarissa said softly. About having enough power that nothing could hurt me. But real happiness, it requires the opposite. It requires letting go of control, trusting, being vulnerable, all the things I thought were weaknesses. They're not weaknesses, Chris said. They're the hardest, bravest things we can do. A young girl approached them shyly, maybe 12 years old, wearing a worn backpack. Excuse me, she said quietly. Are you Mr. Amzo? The teacher. I am, Chris said, kneeling down to her eye level. What's your name? Maria, she said. My mom said you used to teach at my school, before it closed. She said you were the only teacher who believed she could go to college. She did, because of you. She's a nurse now. Chris felt his throat tighten. What's your mom's name? Rosa Martinez, the girl said, and Chris did remember. A bright student who'd struggled with confidence, whom he tutored after school for free, helping her see her own potential. I remember your mother, Chris said warmly. She was brilliant. Are you a student here? Maria nodded enthusiastically. I want to be a doctor. Mom says if you believe in yourself and work hard, anything is possible. And this place, she gestured around the center, it's going to help me get there. After Maria left, Clarissa looked at Chris with something like awe. You changed that woman's life 20 years ago, and now we get to help change her daughter's life. That's legacy, Chris. That's what matters. We are doing it together, Chris said. That's what makes it meaningful. As they left the center that evening, Chris glanced back at the building, glowing in the twilight. Inside, hundreds of students would find hope, opportunity, transformation, the same gifts he and Clarissa had given each other. From humiliation to healing. From transaction to transformation. From the lowest depths of desperation to the heights of purpose-driven love. The journey had been painful, complicated, and at times almost unbearable. But standing here now, with Clarissa's hand in his, their family whole and happy, their purpose clear and their future bright, Chris wouldn't change a single moment of it. Because sometimes the worst things that happen to us contain the seeds of the best things we become. Sometimes we have to lose everything to discover what truly matters. Sometimes we have to kneel in humiliation before we can stand in dignity. And sometimes, when we are brave enough to be vulnerable, weak enough to ask for help, and open enough to change, we discover that love, real, transformative, redemptive love, is worth every sacrifice. Even kissing the feet of a billionaire. Even surrendering pride for purpose. Even walking through hell to reach the heaven that waits on the other side. Chris looked at Clarissa, saw her smile, saw the love in her eyes that had replaced the cold calculation that once defined her, and knew with absolute certainty. Everything had changed. And everything that changed had been worth it. Thank you so much for taking your precious time listening. I so much love you. Please before you leave don't forget to like, comments and subscribe.